Call came at 2:47 in the morning, and I remember staring at the clock on my nightstand like the numbers meant something. Like if I looked long enough, they'd explain why my daughter's number was lighting up my phone at that hour. I answered before the second ring. She didn't say hello. She didn't say anything for a long moment. Just breathing, shallow and uneven. The kind of breathing that tells you someone is trying very hard not to fall apart. Dad. One word. That's all it took. I was already sitting up, already reaching for my glasses on the nightstand. 63 years old, and my body knew before my brain did. Something was wrong with my child. I'm here, I said. Talk to me. I'm at the Royal Victoria. Her voice cracked on the last word. I didn't want to call you. I didn't want to wake you. But I didn't know who else. I'm on my way. I didn't ask what happened. I didn't ask if it was serious. I got dressed in the dark, grabbed my keys off the kitchen hook, and drove through a November Montreal night that was so cold and quiet it felt like the whole city was holding its breath. My thought to Wishway. I'll call her my girl, because that's what she's always been to me. No matter that she's 31 years old and a registered nurse, and more capable than most people I've ever met. Had been married for 2 years when that phone call came. Her husband was a man named Clifford Beaumont. I want you to remember that name, because by the time this story ends, you'll understand why I say it the way I do now. Not with anger anymore, with something quieter than anger. Something that took me a long time to arrive at. Clifford came from what people in certain Montreal circles call old money. His grandfather had built a commercial real estate empire in the eastern townships in the 60s, and by the time Clifford was born, the Beaumonts were the kind of family that had a lawyer on retainer the way regular people have a family doctor. They summered in the Laurentians. They had a box at the Bell Center. His mother collected charitable board memberships the way other women collect handbags. When my daughter first brought him home for dinner, this was maybe 4 months into their relationship, I remember thinking he was polished. Very polished. The kind of man who knows exactly how firmly to shake another man's hand. He called me sir without being told to. Complimented my wife's tuchya. Asked thoughtful questions about my work. I was a retired civil engineer. I'd spent 35 years working on municipal infrastructure projects across Quebec. Not glamorous work, but honest work, and I was proud of it. Clifford seemed to respect that. Or he seemed to. My wife passed away 8 years ago. Ovarian cancer. 17 months from diagnosis to the end. And the end was on a Tuesday in October. And I have never been the same person since. I don't say that for sympathy. I say it because you need to understand that my daughter and I only have each other. We have a mother-sister in Vancouver. We have cousins scattered around, but in the way that actually matters. In the everyday, show up when it's hard way, it's just the two of us. So when she married Clifford, I paid attention. I paid more attention than I let on, because I didn't want to be that father. The difficult one. The one who makes his daughter feel like she has to choose. I noticed things though. Small things at first. The way he'd correct her in conversation. Gently, always gently, but consistently. That's not quite how it happened, love. Or, I think you're misremembering. She'd go quiet in a way I hadn't seen in her before. My daughter was never a quiet person. She was the kid who argued with her teachers, who called her school principal by his first name at age 12, because she said it was more respectful to treat people like equals. She had opinions. She had volume. Around Clifford, she got smaller. I told myself it was adjustment. Marriage changes people, I thought. She's building a life with someone, and that requires compromise. And compromise sometimes looks like restraint from the outside. I told myself this for 2 years. Then the phone rang at 2:47 in the morning. When I got to the Royal Victoria, she was sitting in a chair in the emergency waiting area in street clothes. Jeans, a sweater, her winter coat still on, her arms wrapped around herself. She'd been crying, but she wasn't crying anymore. She'd gone to that place past crying where your face just empties out. I sat down next to her and I put my arm around her, and I didn't say anything. We sat like that for a while. Eventually she told me she'd slipped on the ice on their front steps. That's what she said. She'd slipped, hit the railing, bruised her ribs. The ER doctor had cleared her. Nothing broken, just badly bruised. And she'd been waiting for a cab when she'd called me instead. I looked at her. She didn't look back at me. Was there ice on the steps? I asked. A long pause. There's always ice this time of year, she said. I'm not a man who pushes. I've never been. My wife used to tease me about it. said I'd rather build a tunnel under a problem than confront it directly. Engineers, she'd say, shaking her head. But sitting in that waiting room, looking at my daughter's empty face, I felt something shift in my chest. Not anger yet. Something older than anger. Something that lives right below the breastbone and only wakes up when one of your own is in danger. I drove her home that night, not to the house she shared with Clifford, to my apartment in NDG. She slept in her old room, in the bed that still had the same duvet she'd picked out at 16, with the little yellow flowers on it. I sat at the kitchen table until 5 in the morning drinking tea. I didn't taste, thinking about the way she'd paused before answering my question. Over the next 3 weeks, I started paying a different kind of attention. I am not an investigator. I want to be clear about that. I'm a retired engineer who likes hockey and woodworking, and the occasional fishing trip up to the Saguenay. But I spent my career solving infrastructure problems, and the fundamental skill in that work is observation. You look at what is actually there, not what you want or expect to be there. You follow the evidence. What I observed was this. My daughter had stopped mentioning her friends. She'd had a close group. Women she'd gone to nursing school with. A couple of girls from her old neighborhood in Plateau, Montreal. I hadn't heard their names in months. When I asked, she'd say, "Oh, we've been busy, you know how it is." Clifford had a busy social calendar, she explained, and it was easier to keep things simple. I observed that she no longer had direct access to her own bank account in any practical sense. She and Clifford had merged their finances when they married. Her idea at the time, she thought it was romantic, and now all the household expenses went through a joint account that Clifford managed. She had a small personal account with what she described as spending money. When I asked how much, she hesitated and said enough. I observed that her nursing shifts had been reduced. She'd gone from full-time to 2 days a week, and when I asked why, she told me that Clifford felt it was better for them if she wasn't so exhausted all the time, for their relationship, for their future family. And I observed over the course of several careful conversations that my daughter, my loud, opinionated, cause-principles by their first-name daughter, no longer seemed to trust her own memory of events. She'd start to tell me something and then stop herself. She'd say, "I think that's what happened," or "I might be getting the details wrong." I never heard her speak about herself that way before in 31 years. I have a friend named Walter. We've known each other since university. We both studied engineering at McGill, though Walter went into law instead of building things. He spent 20 years as a Crown prosecutor before moving into private practice. I called him on a Thursday morning in December and asked him to have lunch with me. I told him everything I'd observed. Walter is 70 years old. He has a face like a retired boxer, and the patience of a man who has sat through 10,000 hours of courtroom testimony. He let me talk without interrupting, and when I finished, he set down his fork and said, "You know what you're describing." "I know," I said. "Have you said anything to her?" "Not directly. I don't think she's ready to hear it directly." Walter nodded slowly. "There's a woman I want you to call," he said. "She specializes in this. She'll know how to talk to your daughter in a way that doesn't make her feel like she's being handled." Her name was Dr. Isabelle Fontaine. She was a clinical psychologist who worked extensively with what she called coercive control situations. She had an office on Sherbrooke Street West. I called her the next day. I want to pause here and say something about the weeks that followed, because I don't want to give the impression that everything moved quickly or cleanly. It didn't. My daughter resisted the idea of seeing a psychologist for almost 3 weeks. She said she wasn't that kind of person, which broke my heart, because what she meant was she wasn't someone who needed help, and the fact that she'd come to feel that way was itself part of the damage that had been done to her. It was a Sunday afternoon in January when she finally talked. Really talked. We were at my kitchen table and I'd made her mother's chicken soup. The one with the little dumplings she'd always called cloud soup as a kid. And something about the soup. The smell of it, I think. The familiar smell of something safe opened something up in her. She talked for 2 hours. What she described was a process so gradual she hadn't seen it happening until she was already in the middle of it. The corrections, "That's not quite right, love," had accumulated into a steady erosion of her confidence in her own perceptions. The merged finances had been framed as partnership and had become control. The reduced work hours had been framed as care and had become isolation. And the friends, one by one, had been made to feel unwelcome. Plans cancelled at the last minute, social situations made uncomfortable in subtle ways, until it was just easier not to invite them anymore. And then there were the nights when Clifford's temper showed itself more plainly. He'd never hit her. I need to be precise about that. But there are other ways to make someone afraid, and he had explored several of them. The thrown objects, the blocked doorways, the very controlled, very quiet voice that meant she needed to be careful about what she said next. The bruised ribs were not from ice on the front steps. When she told me that, I had to get up from the table. I walked to the window and I stood there looking out at the January street, the piled snow, the grey sky, the neighbors' houses with their lights on. And I breathed. Just breathed. Because I was 63 years old, with a bad knee and a heart condition I wasn't supposed to stress. And what I wanted to do in that moment would not have helped my daughter at all. So I breathed, and I came back to the table. And I held her hands and I told her I believed her, and I watched something come back into her face that I hadn't seen in 2 years. Here is what people don't understand about men like Clifford Beaumont. They are very good at seeming reasonable. That is their primary skill. By the time we began what I'll call the quiet work of the next several months, Clifford had already begun building a narrative. He told mutual acquaintances that my daughter was struggling with her mental health. He told his own family and his family had reached in certain Montreal social circles that she'd become erratic, that he was very worried about her, that he was trying to support her through a difficult time. He called me once in February. He was warm. He was concerned. He asked if I'd noticed anything worrying in her behavior. He said he felt so alone in trying to help her. I listened carefully. I said very little. I kept the call short and I ended it by telling him that I was sure things would work out. After I hung up, I called Walter. Walter had already been making inquiries. There are things you can find out if you know the right people and you're patient. Clifford's grandfather's empire was not in the robust shape the family presented to the world. There had been significant legal disputes in the last decade over property holdings. Several of the commercial properties in the portfolio carried substantial debt. Clifford personally was not wealthy in any independent sense. His lifestyle was maintained through access to a family trust that his mother, a formidable woman named something I'll keep private, controlled quite directly. But here was the piece that mattered most. My late wife, had left her daughter a trust of her own. Not enormous by Beaumont standards, but significant. $140,000, built carefully over a lifetime of savings, administered through a small investment firm in Westmount and scheduled to fully vest when my daughter turned 32. She was turning 32 in June. Walter and I sat with that information for a long time. He knew about it before the wedding, Walter said. It wasn't a question. She would have mentioned it, I said. She had no reason not to. And the vesting date is public record through the trust registration. I thought about the timeline, the gradual isolation, the merging of finances, the reduction in work hours, making her financially dependent, the slow dismantling of her confidence and her outside relationships. I thought about what Clifford had started doing in January, the narrative about her mental health. I thought about what that narrative would be worth in a divorce proceeding if it were well established enough, if the right people believed it, if there were enough concerned voices, family, acquaintances, maybe even a compliant doctor saying the same thing. A contested competency claim in a divorce proceeding can freeze assets. It can take years to resolve. In the meantime, a vesting trust can become a point of dispute, especially if a spouse can establish a shared finances precedent. I am a retired engineer. I am not a cynical man, but I had built enough public infrastructure in this province to know that some structures look solid from the outside and are hollow at the core. And Clifford Beaumont, I now understood, had been building a structure around my daughter for 2 years. He just hadn't expected her father to be an engineer. Dr. Fontaine was extraordinary. I want to say that clearly, because what she did with my daughter over those months, the quiet, careful rebuilding of her trust in her own perceptions, her own memories, her own judgment, was as skilled as anything I've ever watched a person do. My daughter started sleeping better. She went back to full-time hours at the hospital. She called her nursing school friends, one by one, and the conversations were hard, but they happened. Walter, for his part, was building something else. He connected us with a family law specialist, a woman with an office in Ville-Marie, who had handled exactly this kind of case before. The financial documentation we needed, the paper trail of control, the records showing the pattern of asset management, the records that complicated Clifford's emerging narrative, existed. It just had to be found and organized by someone who knew what they were looking for. The key piece came from an unexpected direction. Clifford had a business contact, a commercial tenant in one of the family's Laval properties, a man who had been trying to renegotiate his lease and who had found himself suddenly in a much worse position than he'd started, through means he described to Walter as pressure I'd never encountered in 30 years of business. This man had documentation. He'd kept records because he'd been frightened, and frightened people sometimes keep very good records. What those records showed was that Clifford's approach to my daughter was not new. It was a method. It had been applied before in a business context, with the same patience and the same eye toward a specific financial outcome. Pattern evidence, Walter told me. In family court, pattern evidence matters. I won't give you every detail of the legal proceedings. They were long and they were expensive. And there were moments, several moments, where I sat in Walter's office and felt the weight of it. The sheer grinding weight of trying to hold a powerful family accountable for something they'd done in private and denied publicly. Clifford retained 3 lawyers. His mother wrote letters to people. There were conversations I'm sure I'll never know about. But I had 2 things they didn't account for. I had Walter, who had been a crown prosecutor for 20 years and who, as he told me once over a late dinner at his kitchen table, had no intention of watching a man do to someone's daughter what he had failed to prevent in 3 cases early in his career. There was a quiet fury in Walter that I recognized, because it lived in me too. And in quiet men it burns longer than people expect. And I had my daughter, who stood up in a proceeding and told the truth about what had happened to her, with a clarity and steadiness that she had rebuilt month by month with Dr. Tabar, Pontaine's help, and with soup on Sunday afternoons, and with phone calls that sometimes lasted 2 hours and said nothing except that she was not alone. The divorce was finalized in the autumn, 16 months after the 2047 phone call. The competency narrative Clifford had been building went nowhere. It is considerably harder to establish a mental health claim against a working registered nurse with a consistent employment record and a treating psychologist, prepared to provide documentation. The trust vested as scheduled in June. It stayed with my daughter. Clifford's family, I understand, went through a difficult period in the months that followed. The Laval tenants' records had attracted attention from people whose attention the Beaumonts did not want. There were audits. There were quiet settlements. The kind of business disruptions that don't make the papers, but reshape a family's position in certain circles quite significantly. I don't feel satisfaction about that part. I want to be honest. There's a difference between justice and satisfaction, and I think you get yourself into trouble when you confuse the two. What I feel is something more like relief, I suppose. The relief of a structure that was unsafe being made safe again. The relief of the engineer. It was a Thursday in November. Exactly 2 years after that night, I drove to the Royal Victoria, to the cold, quiet city, when my daughter and I drove up to the Laurentians for the weekend. We rented a small cabin on a lake north of Mont Tremblant, the same cabin we used to go to when she was a teenager, back when her mother was still alive, and the 3 of us would play cards after dinner and argue cheerfully about hockey. We sat on the cabin porch that first evening, bundled in our coats, watching the last of the light leave the lake. She'd brought the good tea. We were quiet for a while in the way that only people who are truly comfortable with each other can be quiet. I'm going back to full-time rotation next month, she said. I might apply for the ICU coordinator position in the spring. You'd be good at that, I said. She looked at me. Dad, I know you did things I don't know the full details of. With Walter. With the lawyer. I didn't say anything. I just want to say. She stopped. Look back at the lake. I want to say that you never made me feel like you were handling me, the whole time. You were there, and you let me get there myself. I thought about my wife who had always said I was better at tunnels than confrontations. I thought about how she'd also said, every time she said it, that tunnels were sometimes what you needed. Cloud soup, I said. That's all it was. My daughter laughed. It was the same laugh she'd had at 7 years old, at 17. At 25. The loud one, the unguarded one, the one that had nothing careful or diminished about it. It was the best sound I'd heard in 2 years. And if this story found you tonight, wherever you are, whoever you're worrying about at 2 in the morning, I want you to know that the call is worth answering. The soup is worth making. The quiet work, the patient work, the showing up work, it matters more than you know. It is the most important infrastructure any of us will ever build. I've thought a lot about what actually saved my daughter. Not the lawyer, not the court proceeding, not even Walter's years of quiet expertise. And I keep coming back to something much smaller than any of that. It was a pause. A single pause before she answered my question about the eyes on the front steps. That pause told me everything, and I almost missed it. I almost drove her home that night, made sure she was settled, and told myself she was fine, because she'd said she was fine. The reason I didn't miss it is because I'd spent 35 years being paid to notice what wasn't there. A missing support. A stress fracture invisible to the eye, but present in the data. Engineering teaches you that the most dangerous failures are the ones that look stable right up until they aren't. I didn't save my daughter because I'm a particularly brave man or a particularly wise one. I saved her because I'd learned, over a long career, that what a structure appears to be and what it actually is are two completely different questions, and that only one of those questions matters. Clifford was a man of considerable intelligence applied entirely in the wrong direction. He was methodical. He was patient. He understood that you don't tear something down all at once. You undermine it slowly, quietly, until it collapses under its own weight and everyone around it thinks the collapse was inevitable. He did this to my daughter over 2 years, and he did it to at least one business tenant before her, and he likely would have continued doing it to others. That kind of intelligence, turned away from any honest purpose and toward the control of other people, is one of the lonelier things I've ever seen up close. Whatever he was trying to build, security, power, the feeling of being untouchable, none of it was real. It was hollow at the core, the way the worst infrastructure always is. What I want to say to anyone who is sitting somewhere tonight, worried about someone they love, is this: the most important thing you can do is stay honest about what you're actually seeing. Not what you hope is true, not what would be easier to believe. What is actually there, in front of you, in the pause before the answer. That honesty takes something. It takes a willingness to know things you'd rather not know, and to act on them, even when the acting is hard and slow and expensive and uncertain. That's not a comfortable kind of strength, but it's the kind that holds. My daughter rebuilt herself with that same kind of strength, the quiet, daily kind. She went back to work. She called her friends. She sat with Dr. Fontaine week after week and did the hard, unglamorous work of learning to trust herself again. There was nothing dramatic about it. It looked, from the outside, like just a woman going about her life. But I watched it happen and I know what it cost her, and I have never been more proud of anything in my life. What Clifford didn't account for, what people like him never seem to account for, is that the things they try to dismantle don't always stay dismantled. Character has a way of reasserting itself. The person you've always been has a way of finding her way back to the surface. When someone she trusts holds out a hand and says, "I believe you, I'm here, take your time." That's all any of us can offer each other, in the end. But it turns out that's also exactly enough.